The dry goods store smelled like burlap and dust. Afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching every speck floating in the air. Martha Hale stood at the counter with her back straight and her hands folded in front of her. She wore a faded dress that had been mended twice at the elbows. Her hair was pulled back tight, not a strand loose. She looked like a woman who had learned to carry weight without showing it. The clerk stood behind the counter with the ledger open between them. Martha asked for flour. 5 pounds. She asked for salt. A small bag. Her voice was steady, clear. She said she would pay when the wheat came in. She said it the way someone says something true. The clerk shook his head. He turned the ledger around so she could see the page. Her husband's name was written there in black ink. 4 lines. 5. The clerk's finger traced down the column. He said the name was already written too many times. He said winter didn't make exceptions. Not even for widows. Martha didn't flinch. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. Pride costs too much when you have so little left to spend. Half the town was watching. 3 men stood near the stove, pretending to warm their hands. 2 women examined bolts of fabric they had no intention of buying. Everyone saw. Everyone heard. One of the men laughed, low and short. Someone muttered that charity ruined people. That it made them soft. That it taught them to expect things they hadn't earned. Martha turned and walked toward the door. Her boots made small sounds on the wooden floor. No one moved to help. No one spoke her name. She pushed the door open and stepped into the cold street. The wind hit her face, sharp and unforgiving. She pulled her shawl tighter and started walking. Outside, a man stood tying his horse to the rail. He was tall, lean, wearing a coat that had seen better years. His hat was pulled low. His hands moved steady and sure over the leather straps. He had been there when Martha went inside. He had heard everything through the open door. His name was Jonah Pike. He didn't know Martha Hale. Didn't know her husband's name or how he died or why the ledger carried so much ink. But he knew the sound of a door closing on someone who had nowhere else to turn. Jonah waited until Martha was gone. Then he stepped inside the store. The men by the stove watched him. The clerk looked up, wary. Jonah walked to the counter without hurry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 coins. Silver. Not much. Not enough for a feast. Enough for supper. He laid the coins on the counter. He said to bag up flour and salt. 5 pounds. 1 small bag. He said to keep it quiet. The clerk hesitated. Then he took the coins. He moved to the shelves and started filling a cloth sack. The men by the stove exchanged glances but said nothing. Jonah stood still, waiting. When the bag was tied, he took it and walked out without another word. The street was empty now. Martha had already disappeared beyond the edge of town. Jonah untied his horse, slung the sack over the saddle, and swung up. He turned the horse and rode slowly in the direction she had gone. The wind pushed against him. The sky hung low and gray. Somewhere ahead, a woman walked alone toward a home that offered little warmth. And behind her, a stranger followed with flour and salt, and no name she would recognize. Jonah kept his distance. He didn't want to startle her. Didn't want her thinking he was something other than what he was. The road out of town was rutted and hard, cut through prairie grass that stretched in every direction. No trees. No shelter. Just open land and a sky that looked like it might break open any moment. Martha walked with purpose, her shawl wrapped tight against the cold. She never looked back. Jonah wondered if she knew someone was following. Wondered if she cared. After a mile, he nudged his horse forward. The hoof beats made her stop. She turned slowly, her hand moving to shade her eyes against the flat winter light. When she saw him, her expression didn't change. No fear. No relief. Just waiting. Jonah pulled the horse to a stop a few yards away. He touched the brim of his hat. He said her name. Martha. He'd heard the clerk say it inside. She watched him, silent. Her eyes were the color of deep water. Tired, but not defeated. There's a difference. Jonah didn't waste words. He told her he'd bought flour and salt at the store. Said he had no use for it himself. Said if she'd allow it, he'd like to bring it to her place and share supper. He didn't call it charity. Didn't frame it as kindness. Just a simple exchange. Food for company. Martha studied him the way you study weather before deciding whether to plant or wait. She looked at his face, his hands, the way he sat his horse. Looked for the things men hide when they want something. She'd learned to read those signs years ago. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm. She asked where he was from. Jonah said north. Said he'd been riding through. She asked what he wanted. He said nothing she wasn't willing to give. Said he'd eat and leave. Said he wouldn't overstay. Martha considered this. The wind picked up, pushing her shawl back from her shoulders. She pulled it tight again. Then she nodded once. Not because she trusted him, but because her boy would be hungry, and hunger makes decisions for you when pride can't afford to. She told him to follow. Said her place was 2 miles further. Said he could tie his horse outside. She turned and started walking again. Jonah stayed back, keeping the same distance as before. The land stretched out around them, empty and cold. No other homesteads. No other smoke rising. Just the two of them moving through the vastness like figures in a painting no one would ever see. The road became a path. The path became wheel ruts through grass. Then Martha turned off toward a stand of low hills. Jonah followed. The homestead appeared slowly, like something emerging from a dream. A lean cabin, wood gone gray from weather. A small barn, barely standing. A fence that had given up in places. Smoke rose thin from the chimney. Jonah could see the shape of poverty in every board, every crooked post. This was what remained when everything else had been taken. Martha stopped at the door. She turned to face him. She said her boy was inside. Said his name was Ben. Said he'd been through enough and didn't need strangers bringing trouble. Jonah nodded. He said he understood. Said he'd be respectful. Martha held his gaze a moment longer. Then she pushed the door open and went inside. Jonah dismounted, tied his horse to a post that leaned slightly left, and lifted the sack from the saddle. He stood there a moment, looking at the cabin. Small. Fragile. Held together by more than wood. Then he followed her inside. The cabin was one room. Small windows let in thin light that barely reached the corners. A table sat in the center, scarred and uneven. 2 chairs. A stove against the far wall, its pipe rising crooked through the roof. A bed in one corner, a smaller pallet in another. Shelves held a few tin plates, 2 cups, and a pot. Everything wore down to what was necessary. A boy sat at the table. 8 years old, maybe 9. Thin as a fence rail, with his mother's dark eyes. He wore a shirt too big for him, sleeves rolled up several times. His hands rested flat on the table, still and careful. When Jonah entered, the boy's eyes tracked him but his head didn't move. Martha set her shawl on a peg by the door. She said the boy's name. Ben. She told him they had a guest for supper. Ben nodded once. The kind of nod children give when they've learned that words can be dangerous. When staying quiet keeps you safe. Jonah set the sack on the table. He removed his hat and held it in his hands. He said hello to the boy. Ben didn't answer, just watched. His eyes were old for his age. Too old. Martha moved to the stove. She opened the sack and pulled out the flour, the salt. Her hands paused for just a moment, fingers pressing into the cloth. Then she continued. She worked without speaking, measuring flour into a bowl, adding water from a bucket, mixing cornbread batter with steady movements. She'd done this 1,000 times. Her hands knew the work even when her mind was somewhere else. Jonah stood near the door, unsure. Martha glanced at him and nodded toward a chair. He sat slowly, placing his hat on the table. Ben watched him from across the wood. Neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that fills spaces where words have proven useless. Where talking doesn't change anything, so people stop trying. Martha cut bacon from a small piece hanging near the stove. 3 thin strips. She laid them in a pan. The smell filled the cabin, rich and almost too much after so much emptiness. She opened a jar of beans and spooned them into a pot. She poured the cornbread batter into a skillet and set it on the stove. Jonah could see how she stretched everything. How she made little look like enough. It was a skill born from necessity, practiced until it became instinct. Ben's eyes followed his mother's movements. Then they returned to Jonah. The boy was trying to understand who this man was. Why did he come? Whether he'd stay or leave like everyone else had. Jonah met his gaze but didn't smile. Didn't try to win him over with false warmth. Children know when adults are pretending. Ben deserved honesty, even if it was just silent honesty. Martha brought the food to the table. Cornbread in the center. Beans in a chipped bowl. Bacon divided onto 3 tin plates. Not much, but it was more than they'd had in days. She sat down and folded her hands. Ben did the same. They ate without talking. The only sounds were forks against tin, the crackle of the stove, wind pushing against the cabin walls. The cornbread was dense and good. The beans were plain but filling. The bacon was a luxury none of them took for granted. Jonah ate slowly, carefully. He didn't take more than his share. He watched Ben eat with the focused intensity of a hungry child trying not to show it. Watched Martha eat like someone who'd forgotten that food was supposed to be more than fuel. When the plates were empty, Martha collected them. She poured water from the bucket into a basin and began washing. Jonah stood. He said he should be going. Said he appreciated the meal. Martha turned from the basin. She didn't thank him. Didn't tell him to come back. Just nodded, the same way she'd nodded in town when the clerk refused her credit. A nod that meant she'd heard. That she understood. Nothing more. Jonah picked up his hat. He looked at Ben one more time. The boy's expression hadn't changed. Still watching. Still waiting to see what this stranger would do next. Jonah walked to the door. He stepped outside into the cold. The sun was setting, turning the sky the color of old bruises. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle. He didn't look back at the cabin. But he thought about the boy's thin frame. About Martha's careful hands. About the way silence had filled that room like water filling a well. He rode back toward town as darkness gathered around him. Martha woke before dawn. She always did. The cabin was cold, the stove burned down to ash. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and moved quietly so Ben wouldn't wake. She stoked the fire, added kindling, and blew gently until flames caught. Then she sat at the table and watched the window lighten from black to gray. She thought about the stranger. Jonah Pike. He'd eaten and left without lingering. Without asking questions. Without making promises he couldn't keep. That was something. Most men filled silence with words they didn't mean. Jonah had let the silence stand. But she didn't expect him to return. Men like him drifted. They moved through towns and lived like wind through grass, leaving no trace. She'd learned not to count on anything that wasn't already in her hands. Ben stirred on his pallet. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. Martha told him to dress warmly. There was work to do. There was always work to do. They spent the morning like they spent every morning. Checking the few chickens they had left. Hauling water from the creek. Chopping wood that had already been chopped too small. Making little last as long as possible. Around midday, Ben stopped and pointed. A rider was coming across the prairie. Single horse, moving steady. Martha's hand went to the axe handle leaning against the woodpile. Then she recognized the shape. The coat. The way the man sat on his horse. Jonah Pike. He rode up to the fence and dismounted. He carried a burlap sack over one shoulder. He nodded to Martha, then to Ben. He said he'd brought seed potatoes. Said he'd heard winter had been hard and spring planting might go easier with a head start. He didn't ask permission. Just set the sack down by the door. Martha stared at the sack. Then at him. She asked why. Jonah shrugged. Said he'd had them. Said they'd go to waste otherwise. It was a lie, and they both knew it. But it was the kind of lie that made it possible to accept help without losing dignity. Martha recognized the gift in that. She asked if he'd eaten. Jonah said he hadn't. She told him there was coffee. Not much, but it was hot. They sat outside on two stumps that served as chairs. Ben stayed close to his mother, still watching Jonah with careful eyes. The coffee was weak but warm. They drank in silence, looking out at the land that stretched forever in every direction. After a while, Jonah noticed the door. The top hinge was loose, making it hang crooked. He asked if she had tools. Martha said there were some in the barn. Her husband's tools. She hadn't touched them in 3 years. Jonah stood and walked to the barn. It was dim inside, smelling of old hay and rust. He found a hammer, some nails, and a few other pieces that might be useful. He carried them back and spent the next hour fixing the door. Straightening it. Tightening the hinge. Making it close properly for the first time in months. Ben watched from a distance. Watched how Jonah held the hammer. How he tested the door after each adjustment. How he worked without rushing or complaining. When the door was fixed, Jonah moved to the woodpile. He didn't ask. Just picked up the axe and started splitting. The sound rang out across the empty land. Sharp. Rhythmic. The sound of work being done. Martha came outside. She told him he didn't have to do that. Jonah said he knew. Said he wanted to. Said work was easier when it was shared. She stood there a moment, watching him. Then she went back inside. When she returned, she brought water in a tin cup. Jonah stopped and drank. He thanked her. Then he went back to splitting wood. The afternoon passed this way. Jonah is working. Martha tended to the cabin. Ben moves between them, orbiting like a small moon caught between two larger bodies. No one spoke much. Words weren't necessary. The work said everything that needed saying. When the sun started its descent, Jonah stacked the split wood against the cabin wall. He returned the tools to the barn. He brushed sawdust from his coat and picked up his hat. Martha stood in the doorway. She said he could stay for supper if he wanted. Jonah looked at her. Then at Ben, who stood half-hidden behind his mother. He said he'd like that. Said he'd appreciate it. They went inside together. The three of them. The cabin felt less empty than it had the day before. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. Days turned into a pattern. Jonah would appear in the morning, sometimes with something useful, sometimes with just his hands and willingness to work. He mended the fence where posts had rotted through. He cleared the drainage ditch that had been filled with debris. He set snares along the creek for rabbits, checking them each evening before he left. Martha stopped asking why he came. She stopped waiting for him to ask for something in return. She just accepted the rhythm of it. His presence became part of the day, like sunrise or the wind that never stopped blowing. Ben began to move closer. Not all at once. Gradually. He'd stand a little nearer when Jonah worked. Watch a little longer. One afternoon, when Jonah was repairing a section of fence, Ben picked up a hammer without being asked and held a board steady while Jonah nailed it down. Jonah didn't make a fuss about it. Just nodded his thanks and kept working. The boy was learning. Learning how a steady man moved through the world. How he approached problems. How he finished what he started. These were lessons his father might have taught him, if fever hadn't taken the man 3 winters back. Martha watched them together. Watched Ben's small hands trying to grip tools made for grown men. Watched Jonah slow his pace so the boy could keep up. Neither of them spoke much, but something was being built between them that had nothing to do with fences or wood. One evening, after they'd eaten, Jonah lingered at the table longer than usual. The lamp burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Ben had fallen asleep on his pallet, exhausted from a day spent hauling stones from the field. Martha refilled Jonah's coffee. The silence between them had changed over the weeks. It was no longer the guarded silence of strangers. It was something softer. More comfortable. Jonah turned the tin cup in his hands. He said her husband must have been a good man to build what he'd built out here. Must have been strong. Martha looked at the table. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was steady but low. She said his name had been Thomas. Said he'd been a freighter, hauling goods between settlements. Said he'd been strong, yes. Strong and stubborn and determined to make something out of nothing. She told Jonah about the last trip. 3 winters back. Thomas had taken a load north, promising to be back before the heavy snows came. But fever caught him on the road. Took him in 3 days. The wagon came home without him, driven by another freighter who'd found it abandoned. They'd buried Thomas somewhere along the trail. Martha never learned exactly where. She said she'd kept the homestead because it was all she had left of him. Because giving up felt like losing him twice. Jonah listened without interrupting. He didn't offer empty comfort. Didn't tell her time would heal or that Thomas was in a better place. He just listened, and sometimes listening was worth more than all the kind words people could pile on top of grief. After a while, Martha asked about him. Asked why a man like him was drifting. Why did he have no place of his own? Jonah stared into his coffee. The lamplight flickered across his face, making the lines there deeper. He said he'd had a place once. Near Cheyenne. Said his wife had been buried there. Childbirth. She'd lived long enough to hold their daughter. The baby hadn't made it through the night. He said he'd sold the place after. Said staying there had been like living in a grave. The quiet remembered everything. Every laugh. Every plan they'd made. Every future that would never come. So he'd started drifting. Keep moving because moving was easier than standing still in all that emptiness. Martha reached across the table. She didn't take his hand. Just laid her fingers near his. Close enough that he'd know he wasn't alone in the knowing. They sat like that while the lamp burned lower. 2 people who'd lost what they'd built. 2 people who understood that some things break you, but you keep living anyway because there's no other choice. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin. Inside, the silence held them both with something close to tenderness. Spring came slowly, the way it always did on the plains. The ground thawed in patches. Grass began to show green beneath the dead brown. Jonah plowed the field behind a borrowed mule, turning earth that hadn't been turned in 2 years. Martha followed with the seed potatoes he'd brought, pressing them into the dark soil. Ben walked behind her, covering each one with his heel. They worked in a line, 3 figures against the wide sky. No one rushed. The work had its own pace, and they followed it. But spring also brought challenges. A calf they'd hoped to raise for trade came down sick. Martha found it in the morning, lying on its side, breathing shallow. She and Jonah tried everything. Warm water. Blankets. Moving it closer to the barn's shelter. The calf died 2 days later. Martha stood over it, her face empty. One more loss in a long line of losses. Jonah buried the animal without being asked. Ben helped dig, his small shovel moving slow but determined. They didn't speak about it afterward. There was nothing to say. Death was part of living out here. You learn to carry it and keep moving. Then the roof started leaking. Heavy rains came one night, and water dripped through in 3 places. Martha set pots underneath, but by morning the floor was wet and the ceiling boards were dark with moisture. Jonah climbed up to look. The damage was worse than it appeared from inside. Shingles were missing. Others had rotted through. He spent 2 days on that roof. Replacing what could be replaced. Patching what couldn't. Martha brought him water and watched him work against the sky. The height didn't seem to bother him. He moved carefully but confidently, like a man who'd learned to trust his balance. Ben asked if he could help. Jonah said the roof was no place for a boy. But he let Ben hand him tools from the ground. Let him feel like he was part of the fixing. When the roof was done, Jonah climbed down. His hands were scraped and his shirt was dark with sweat. Martha thanked him. He shook his head. Said thanks weren't necessary. Said you fixed what needed fixing. That night, Ben started coughing. Just a little at first. By morning, it was worse. Deep and rattling, coming from somewhere low in his chest. His skin felt hot to the touch. Martha made him stay in bed, wrapped him in every blanket they had. She tried all the remedies she knew. Warm honey. Steam from boiling water. Poultices on his chest. Nothing helped. The cough grew worse. Ben's eyes looked glassy, distant. Fever took him deeper. Martha didn't sleep. She sat by his pallet, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth. Whispering to him even when he couldn't hear. Jonah stayed too. He didn't ask if he should. He just pulled a chair close and sat with her through the long night. He boiled water when she needed it and brought fresh clothes. Kept the stove burning so the cabin stayed warm. When Martha's hands shook from exhaustion, Jonah took over, bathing the boy's face while she rested her head on the table for just a moment. The fever broke on the 3rd night. Ben's breathing eased. His skin cooled. He opened his eyes and looked at his mother with recognition. Martha's breath came out in a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pressed her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. Jonah stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the darkness, giving her a moment to fall apart without being watched. When Ben was strong enough to sit up, Jonah carried him outside. The night was clear and cold. Stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, more stars than anyone could count. Ben looked up, still weak but alive. Jonah held him steady and didn't speak. Just let the boy see that the world was still there. That he'd made it through. Martha stood in the doorway watching them. Watching this man hold her son with the same careful attention he gave to everything. She understood then that reliability could be louder than vows. That showing up, again and again, was its own kind of promise. Ben recovered slowly. Color came back to his cheeks. His cough faded. Within a week he was back outside, still thin but steady on his feet. He stayed close to Jonah now, following him like a shadow. Learning how to set traps properly. How to read animal tracks in the dirt. How to measure twice before cutting once. Jonah taught without lecturing. He showed and let the boy figure things out. When Ben made mistakes, Jonah didn't scold. Just demonstrated again, patient and unhurried. The boy was soaking it all in, hungry for the kind of guidance his young life had been missing. Martha watched the bond between them grow. It filled something in Ben that she hadn't been able to fill alone. A boy needed more than a mother's love. He needed to see how a man carried himself. How he treated his word. How he faced hard things without complaining. One morning, Jonah said he needed to go into town. Supplies were running low. He'd trapped enough rabbits to trade a few hides. Martha started to get ready, but Jonah told her to stay. Said he'd handle it. Said there was no need for her to face those people again. She understood what he meant. The dry goods store. The men who'd laughed. The clerk who'd closed the ledger on her name. Jonah was offering to stand between her and that humiliation. She nodded and let him go. Jonah rode into town alone. The streets were quiet, dust blowing between the buildings. He tied his horse outside the dry goods store and walked inside with the hides rolled under his arm. The same clerk stood behind the counter. The same men warmed their hands by the stove. They looked up when Jonah entered. Recognition flickered across their faces. Jonah laid the hides on the counter. He said he wanted to sell them. The clerk examined them and named a price. It was fair. Jonah took the money. Then he asked for flour. 10 pounds. Salt. Sugar. Coffee. Beans. He counted out coins, paying in full. The clerk bagged everything without comment. But his eyes were different now. Be more careful. Less certain. One of the men by the stove spoke up. Asked if Jonah was staying out at the Hale place. His tone carried something between curiosity and judgment. Jonah turned to look at him. He didn't answer right away. Just held the man's gaze until the question felt smaller. Then he said yes. Said he was helping with the work. Said it was what decent people did. The man didn't respond. Didn't laugh this time. The room stayed quiet. Jonah gathered his purchases and walked out. No one said another word. The power in the room had shifted, subtle but real. Martha's name didn't carry shame anymore. It carried the weight of someone who had help now. Someone who wasn't alone. He rode back to the homestead with the supplies. Martha met him outside. She could see from his face that something had happened. She asked if there'd been trouble. Jonah said no. Said everything went fine. He carried the bags inside and unpacked them on the table. Flour. Salt. Sugar. Coffee. More than they'd had in months. All paid for. No credit. No charity. Just honest trade. Martha touched the bag of flour. Her fingers rested there for a moment. She didn't need to ask what it meant, and he didn't need to explain. The town had seen her differently today because Jonah had stood there on her behalf. Because he'd made it clear she wasn't someone to be dismissed anymore. That evening, they worked side by side preparing supper. Ben set the table. The cabin felt warmer somehow, though the fire wasn't any bigger than usual. There was a sense of things settling into place. Of pieces finding where they belonged. After they ate, Jonah didn't stand to leave. He sat at the table while Martha cleared the plates. Ben was mending a tear in his shirt, concentrating hard on the needle. The lamp burned steadily. Jonah spoke quietly. He said he'd been thinking. Said he could keep drifting the way he'd been doing for 3 years. Or he could stay and help build something that lasted. He wasn't asking to be saved. Wasn't looking for someone to heal his grief. He was offering to share the weight. To be part of what they were building here. He looked at Martha. Said the choice was hers. Said he'd respect whatever she decided. Martha's hands stilled over the basin. She stood there with her back to him, water dripping from her fingers. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the wind outside, the crackle of wood in the stove, Ben's breathing as he waited. Martha took a long time before turning around. When she did, her eyes were clear. She'd spent 3 years carrying everything alone. 3 years proving she could survive without help. But surviving wasn't the same as living. And maybe, just maybe, there was room for something more than survival. She dried her hands on her apron. She looked at Jonah, then at Ben, then back to Jonah. She said yes. Said he could stay. Said they'd figure out the rest as they went. Ben's face broke into a smile. The first real smile he'd shown in months. Jonah nodded, something loosening in his shoulders. No grand declarations. No dramatic embrace. Just a quiet agreement between 3 people who'd found their way to each other through work and patience and showing up when it mattered. They were married 6 weeks later. A simple ceremony in town with a borrowed suit for Jonah and Martha's best dress, the one she'd been saving for something important. A neighbor stood as witness. The preacher spoke the words quickly, like he had somewhere else to be. Jonah and Martha repeated their vows with steady voices. Ben stood between them, one hand holding his mother's, the other holding Jonah's. Afterward, they didn't celebrate. Didn't have a party or a dance. They climbed into the wagon and rode back to the homestead. There was work waiting. There was always work waiting. But things changed in small ways. Jonah's bedroll moved from the barn to the cabin. His few possessions found places on the shelves. Martha cooked for 3 without having to stretch every ingredient so thin. Ben had someone to teach him things his father would have taught him if he'd lived. The cabin filled out. Jonah built new shelves along one wall. Added a second bed for Ben so the boy had his own space. Fixed the windows so they closed properly. Small improvements that added up to something larger. The place began to look like a home instead of just shelter. The garden grew. Potatoes came up strong. They planted beans, squash, and a few other things that might take. The field Jonah had plowed produced enough to see them through winter with some to trade. The chickens started laying better. The work was held. Martha went back to town eventually. Walked into the dry goods store with money in her pocket and her head high. The clerk served her without hesitation. No one laughed. No one muttered about charity. She was Mrs. Pike now, and the name carried weight because the work behind it was real. Summer turned to fall. They harvested what they'd planted. Put up food for winter. Repaired what needed repairing before the cold came. Ben grew taller, filling out, looking less like a scared boy and more like someone who knew his place in the world. One evening, the 3 of them sat outside watching the sun go down. The sky turned orange and purple and deep blue. Jonah had his arm around Martha's shoulders. Ben leaned against them both. No one spoke. Words weren't needed. Inside, the lamp would be lit soon. Supper would be made. They'd sit at the table together and eat food they'd grown themselves on land they'd worked together. Tomorrow there will be more work. There would always be more work. But it was work they'd face together now. Martha had been refused food once. Turned away with half the town watching. That woman felt like someone from another life. Someone smaller. Someone who'd had to beg for what she needed. She didn't beg anymore. She didn't have to. Jonah hadn't changed her life with a single act of kindness. He'd done it by showing up. By staying put. By letting care take the shape of labor, day after day, until the work became a life and the life became home. The wind blew across the prairie, constant and endless. But inside the cabin, there was warmth. There was food. There was a family. And that was enough. If you enjoyed Martha and Jonah's story, please like this video and subscribe for more heartfelt tales from the Wild West. Your support means everything. Thanks for listening.